My hope is that the people in power and with decision-making power will be able to hear what we have to say and will listen to survivors. So we're gonna start off with Jeri and I just having a conversation real quick about what some of our perspectives that we see from InnovationsHTC. InnovationsHTC is where I am a programs director at. I'm also with the City of Seattle Human Rights Commission and co-founder of the Human Collaborative. And we're gonna come from a lot of different perspectives today. Try to give it a succinct viewpoint on commercial sexual exploitation in Washington State, King County, and Seattle. InnovationsHTC is a 501c3 out of, it's a nonprofit out of Olympia, Washington. We're an Indigenous and survivor-led agency. Hey. And our goal is to foster unity and collaboration to end human trafficking.
You know, when we really think about human trafficking, a lot of times people think, oh, this is just something that happens in, you know, foreign countries, and, you know, it's stereotypical, kind of like a HBO special, you know, people coming over in shipping containers, you know, chained to walls and so forth. But, you know, I don't want to dismiss that does happen, but here in the United States, what we see is a large amount of domestic trafficking, which means our own brothers and sisters, aunties, uncles, neighbors are being exploited. What you see here on the map is the Polaris National Trafficking Hotline, and this heat sink map represents calls to the National Human Trafficking Hotline. And these calls can be from a community member where somebody saw something and reported it. It could be a survivor reaching out for resources, law enforcement reporting. I do know that when we, as a direct service organization, have cases, that I do reach out, because it's really important that these are documented, because if human trafficking goes unreported, people think that it's not happening. One of the things that I want to point out on this map is that any place that is red is considered a high density area of calls. And we are here on the West Coast in Washington State. And so if you look at the upper left hand, it is flaming red all the way down the East Coast. And it's also very high density throughout the central United States and the East Coast. And human trafficking is an equal opportunity destroyer. And it doesn't care if you come from rural or urban communities, or what your socioeconomic level is, what your gender identity is. It does not discriminate. And so when we're looking for cases and looking for human trafficking, you just really need to be very open-minded and really recognize and respond and report.
I want to talk a little bit too about journey through identity, journey through life experience. You know, I first came to an understanding that I was a victim of trafficking and a survivor of trafficking and a survivor support group as a case manager, actually. I was dropping off a client who had asked for some more community, some specific supports around her trafficking experience. And I was invited in to sit with this group. I didn't know that they had researched me. I actually had a college presentation about my involvement in the sex trade. And I didn't know it was still on Prezi, and so they had invited me in. I'm really grateful actually that that was still on Prezi, because I would have never had this conceptualization without it. And I seen my sister talking about her experience at the head of this group. And she gave me a gift of understanding that the things that had happened to me weren't my fault. And I didn't understand prior to that moment. And I didn't have the privilege to understand prior to that moment, because I've been surviving for so long, that someone had taken advantage of me. that human trafficking is a crime that exploits vulnerabilities. And actually many people had exploited those vulnerabilities. And people bought and sold me for drugs, for alcohol, for money, for places to stay, for safety. I didn't understand that that wasn't my fault. And it wasn't a consensual act. It wasn't a consensual transaction between two adults. A, I started when I was a child. And B, even as an adult, I had no other options. And I think for me as an Indigenous person, when I look about how human trafficking and the commercial sex trade has affected my people, there was no such thing as prostitution or trafficking prior to first Western contact. And I actually cannot consent as an Indigenous person to the continued settling of my body and my people. I don't consent to that further colonization. So I think when we talk about our journey, there's so many different ways to think about it, right?
There is, you know, and when we're looking at conceptualizing what commercial sexual exploitation or trafficking is, a lot of people don't understand that. And actually, before the year 2000, when the Trafficking Victim Protection Act came out, which was the first federal legislation, I know for myself, I'm a survivor of trafficking. I am an Indigenous woman. I am Shoshone, Bannock, and Cree. And the first time that I read what the Trafficking Victim Protection Act was, it's, you know, anybody under the age of 18 is automatically considered a victim. Age alone is enough mitigating factor. Really, if there's force, fraud, or coercion, in my case, there definitely was force, fraud, or coercion, and I was also a child. And one of the things that I think is really important is that this disproportionately affects people of color and minority communities. And this is facing a culture shock. And, you know, when we're looking, and we're going to talk a little bit more about it, you know, predominantly it is Black and brown people being exploited for sex, and buyers are predominantly middle to upper class white people. And so I can tell you, I want to elaborate a little bit on what my brother Erik said. You know, prior to colonization, prior to people coming and stealing Indigenous land, none of our languages, you cannot find any history that has prostitution, exploitation, anything like that. But what happened is on first contact is when it started. And a lot of people don't know that Christopher Columbus was a sex trafficker and a labor trafficker. If you go back, and it is fact-checked and available to look online, some of his journal entries saying that he could get more in trade for a 9 or 10-year-old Indigenous person than they could trading horses. And that's what the market was. You know, so when we're really looking at our journeys, it's about understanding and conceptualizing what happened to us and being able to find that support and being able to build community and move forward in your healing journey.
Thank you for that.
Yeah.
When we look at some of the ways we've been impacted and things that are helpful, you know, I know for me, culture has been incredibly helpful in grounding me. But to kind of follow up on some of the things that Jeri had mentioned, you know, when colonization has removed our culture, has created polarizations within culture, lateral oppression within access to culture, and really removed a lot of Indigenous knowledge and the ways of maneuvering that, I don't have full access to culture. Culture cannot do for me what my ancestors intended for it to do. And that's directly at the hand of white colonizers. And I think we really have to keep in mind the impacts of that on Indigenous, Black, and Brown people, because that is the impacts that we're facing today. And some of the ways in which I know myself and I have seen in the survivors that I have served is this prevalence of drug and alcohol as a way of coping with that disconnection from who we are and disconnection from healthy ways of being. And also a lifetime of unspeakable oppressions, you know, and trauma. Those all impact us in really profound and at times devastating ways. I remember when I grew up primarily in my culture. I grew up in a military family, directly in a family that dedicated its life to public service. But I also grew up in primarily people of color communities, grew up in primarily Indigenous communities, Filipino communities. And when I was coming back to communities that were predominantly white, that was complete culture shock for me. I didn't know how to navigate those communities. I'd come from communities where if you're having an issue, you know, you can walk around on any given day and find an auntie grilling a pork chop who is willing to give you at least a lunch worth of wisdom, whether you wanted it or not. You know? And that's how I learned to navigate my life in communities that are unlike mine and unlike, don't have that same access to handling life's battles and struggles. Actually, communities that sought to oppress me, whether I was cognizant of that or not. You know, I just think about all the issues we're facing today in the era of George Floyd. You know, those systems that I was navigating weren't ever set up for me to be successful in the same ways that systems around culture are set up to be successful.
I think it's really important that as we're talking about trafficking, that we really talk about risk factors and why are Indigenous people at a heightened risk. This has taken off a socioeconomic or I forgot what it is, I'm so sorry. Anyway, so Indigenous trafficking risk factors. When we're looking at these, we look at individual risk factors, relationship risk factors, community risk factors, and societal risk factors. And when we really look at Indigenous communities, we need to add a fifth one. And the fifth one would be historical trauma. And, you know, when we look at individual, could be prior system involvement, you know, loss of identity. Our LGBTQ2IA+ and Two-Spirit individuals are at a heightened risk. Also, individuals that are immigrants and those that are undocumented find themselves in exploitation, not only here in the United States, but all over the world. And we cannot exclude boys and men. Mm-hmm. We can't. And, you know, really, traffickers target individuals that don't have adequate support systems. And if dysfunction in the home, it could be lack of economic opportunities, lack of training around trafficking. When we look at societal, we have to look at demand. Mm-hmm. And we also have to look at racism and oppression. And when we look at historical, we have to look at generational trauma, destructive federal policies, and an overall lack of trust in the systems. And when we really look at the root causes of vulnerability and work to change and create systems to effectively combat human trafficking and supporting survivors, that's what we need to do. And that's why I'm so excited to be a part of the Human Collaborative.
I think that, Jeri, these issues to me look like they might overlap some. Would it be fair to say that these issues are intersectional?
Oh, 100%. Yeah, and this is not an all-inclusive list. And one of the things that I do want to add on this is trafficking is big business. This is business to people. Globally, it is a $150.2 billion a year criminal enterprise.
Say it again. How much?
$150.2 billion criminal enterprise globally.
So that makes me think, when I see these heightened risk factors, and then you bring up money, and we think about the kind of policy decisions that city council and other decision makers are thinking of right now, how do you think that full decriminalization would help or lessen these risk factors? And do you think that full decriminalization has a vested interest in that $150.2 billion figure?
Don't get me started, Eric. I know we have a time limit, but I would love to be invited back at some other time to just really take a deep dive into that.
Okay.
And so my answer to that, and you can feel my excitement, is 100%. If it wasn't big business, this wouldn't be happening. And when you really look at full decriminalization as opposed to the equality model, it is not about protecting the individual that's involved in prostitution. It's not. It's about decriminalizing buyers. And when we think about buyers, it's not that picture that people try to paint of a disabled guy, and it is people that have shown up to some of the stings right here in Washington State as buyers with date rape drugs, with zip ties, with shovels, with handguns, and all of the other things. So when we're looking at protecting buyers, we are asking for more violence. And the $150.2 billion, when we look at countries like Germany that have fully decriminalized, they are ran by syndicates, criminal enterprises, and the people that are filling these brothels, which, by the way, some of them are 6 stories high and have panic buttons in each room. The people that are filling them are society's most vulnerable, which is no different than the people we are talking about when we're talking about domestic trafficking and indigenous people. And I want to point out too that these risk factors are not just indigenous risk factors. These could go across anybody and everybody. So we have to look at the root causes, and we have to change those and truly support people, so we are not feeding a pipeline to exploitation.
Thank you. Now, we want to talk a little bit about the prevalence that we see for Native Americans in sexual violence and exploitation. According to the NIJ 2016 report, 56% of Native women have experienced sexual violence in their lifetime. We overlay this with the Urban Indian Health Institute's report that shows that Seattle, Washington, our city, is #1 in the nation for murdered and missing Indigenous women cases, with an undeniable link to human trafficking. We really have an issue right here in our front door. When we look at the access to victim services, 38% of that 58% were unable to receive any type of victim services. You overlay that with human trafficking, and you're working with a marginalized population within a marginalized population within a marginalized population. So important to highlight how the equality model emphasizes access to services. Mm-hmm. And full decriminalization is nothing more than a market deregulation around a problem we don't have. Arizona State University did a study around how many buyers were actually looking to buy sex in Seattle, Washington within one 24-hour period. It's over 6,000 buyers. There's no other market I can think of in Seattle that has 6,000 buyers ready within one 24-hour period for a commodity, let alone a commodity that is a person.
You know, and like Erik just said, there's a link between murdered and missing Indigenous people and human trafficking. And sadly, a lot of times when law enforcement gets these cases and the family reveals that they're involved in the commercial sex trade, the priority of investigating the case goes down. And so we support decriminalizing the person that is in prostitution and fully going after traffickers and buyers, because we deserve options and we do not want to have a legacy of exploitation. You know, and I could go through many of these cases, and I could have slides after slides after slides of Indigenous missing people. And, you know, like we said, many of them are linked to the sex trade. And Seattle's #1. And we need to stop this. We do. And full decriminalization is only going to fuel this.
We really need to be listening to more Indigenous peoples and to the different organizations that serve Native American Indigenous peoples in the Seattle area.
Yes, you know, not only listening, but also funders need to be supporting this. I know the MMIP work that we do is not supported financially, and so we do this because we have a passion and we know the link between MMIP and human trafficking.
We definitely support the equality model. It's a model that the City of Seattle Human Rights Commission has signed on to. It's a model that King County has signed on to, and we've seen incredible improvements. And we have a lot further to go. It's not perfect in implementation right now. But as someone with lived experience in this, the equality model is the only thing that would have helped me in retrospect. Nothing about the men who have hurt me getting a free pass would have actually helped me.
Never. You know, as somebody with lived experience, you know, honestly, as an Indigenous woman, I have seen the effects of colonization and destructive biased laws and interactions. And decriminalizing prostitution is colonialism on steroids. It really is.
I think I really want to clear up some things too that are out there in the public area or periphery around commercial sex exploitation, the sex trades, and how the terms people are using. Traffickers are not managers. It's not some friend that's helping you out, maybe in the very rarity of cases, but traffickers are overwhelmingly exploiters who use force, fraud, and coercion, and oftentimes a combination of all three to exploit the vulnerabilities of human trafficking survivors.
And it's very important that you understand that, yes, we could set policies that might make it physically safer, possibly, like red light districts, but you know, those haven't been successful in other countries. But there's absolutely no way you can regulate emotional harm. And this is a lifetime of emotional harm. And you have to realize that trafficking victims have a higher rate of PTSD than returning combat veterans.
And not even a fraction of the support.
No.
And you just cannot regulate that emotional harm.
And nobody talks about that. You know, because you could set up all of the ideas that full decriminalization has, but when you talk about the emotional harm, nobody has an answer. And the answer is we deserve options and we deserve support. And my daughter, my sisters, my brothers, everybody deserves better than that. Honestly, finding my way home, I was trafficked from 13 till 19, and my journey in healing has been a lifetime. And I am incredibly honored to have people in my life, elders that speak wisdom to me, friends, youth, staff. I mean, I've learned just as much from my staff and, my sisters and brothers and our allies, that you can't even believe it. If we have a shared platform with shared leadership and true collaboration, we can do anything. We can.
And we deserve reflections of ourselves, true reflections of ourselves, not this false narrative of empowerment. Similar to the beginning stages of the domestic violence movement, we lack the language to conceptualize the harms done against us.
Yes.
Very similar. We cannot let history repeat itself with trafficking too.
I love this slide, because you can't change the past, but you can definitely learn from it. And everything that's happened in my past, people have often asked me, oh, if you could change things, would you? Of course, nobody wants hurt and harm and trauma, but I can't. So I think it's very important that we take all of those challenges and look at it, that this has molded us into who we are today.
It's a holistic process. We look at the recommendations that we want to give. It's to support the equality model, hold buyers accountable. Liberation comes from awareness, accountability, and autonomy. That is where liberation comes from. Without accountability, there's no liberation. To build opportunities for survivors to earn sustainable income, to give off-ramps out of exploitation, to real choice and autonomy, and develop policies and procedures and for official response protocols. People don't know when you're trying to leave that life that there is total systems failure.
Yes.
People don't know how to handle a trafficking case. And we need to be able to have set guidelines for what needs to happen, at least as a community and a municipality.
Yes.
To know what local services to refer victims to, and if there's not a local service, to advocate for the establishment of one, and to help find resources for both traditional and Western to help survivors access ways of healing. And I just want to give thanks to everyone for listening to our presentation today. If you have any additional questions, you can email Tasha at InnovationsHTC.org. Also email me or Jeri, Erik, ERIK, at InnovationsHTC.org.
Or Jeri, Jeri, at InnovationsHTC.org. Tasha Elliott serves as our resource navigator. And if you have a victim or somebody that is seeking safety, that has had a history in the commercial sex industry, give us a call. We are here to support you because I believe beyond a shadow of a doubt that survivors supporting survivors and peer-to-peer mentoring is an effective model. And I also want to add that our allies are important. And it doesn't matter what race you are or anything. We all need to come together to end exploitation and to combat full decriminalization. Thank you.
Thank you.